Good evening, everybody. Tonight, we're going to learn a Rashi on this week's Parsha, Parsha Shmini. Parsha Shmini, Perik Yud, tells the story about the two sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, who offered an offering of Ketores, who offered an offering of Ketores, of burning incense. Vayitnu v'aneish vayasimu alein Ketores, they took their shovels, they put fire on it, they burnt incense on it. They offered to Hashem an alien, a foreign fire, which He did not command them. The result, a fire came out from Hashem, and consumed them. And they died in the presence of Hashem. Zakt Rashi in Pasuk Beis, Perik Yud Pasuk Beis. Vateitzeyesh. Rashi quotes the two words of the Pasuk Vateitzeyesh, and a fire came out, and he says, Rebbe Lezer says, Lo meisu bnei Aaron ela al yedei shahiru halacha b'fnei Moshe Rabbeinu. The children of Aaron did not die only as a result of the fact that hoiru halacha, they communicated, they gave a directive, a halacha, they communicated a verdict in the presence of Moshe, their Rebbe. This is the reason for their death. Loi meisu, it's the exclusive reason why they died, because in the presence of Moshe, they took the liberty to state a halacha, to state a verdict of behavior. Rabbi Shmuel Loimer, Suye Yayin Nichnasu Lamikdash. Rabbi Shmuel says they died because they went into the mikdash, they went into the sanctuary, intoxicated with wine, they were drunk. Teda, a proof, Sha'achar Misas, and after they died, Hizir Anisarim. Hashem warned the remainders, Aaron and his other two sons, Shala Yikansu, Suye Yayin Lemikdash. They should not go in drunk to the sanctuary. Because we see right after the story, there's a commandment from Hashem to Aaron, Yayin v'shecher al teish, don't drink wine when you're coming into the Oyel Moed, when you're coming into the sanctuary, do not drink. So this is Rabbi Shmuel's proof. Since right after the story, he warns Aaron, Hashem warns Aaron not to come into the Beis HaMikdash drunk. Yayin v'shecher al teish, don't drink wine when you're going in. So why is he warning? Why is he communicating this warning now? Is dach mashma, it seems, this indicates that this was the reason of death. And Rashi continues, Mashal Lamelech, Shahayaloi ben Bayis v'chuli k'de'isa b'vayikra Rab. A metaphor to understand this is from a king who had a ben Bayis, who had somebody living in his home, and Rashi says, etc., as is discussed in the Medrash Vayikra Rabbah. And this is the end of Rashi. On this Rashi, when we reflect on these words of Rashi, there are many questions that come up. Question number one. Rashi wants to know why the children of Aaron died, and he gives two reasons, Rebbe Lezer's reason and Rebbe Shmuel's reason. The question, of course, is the Pasuk gives a reason. The Pasuk says that they offered an alien fire, Asher lo tziva oisam, which he did not command them, and a fire came out from God and consumed them. Yet Rashi feels a need to explain the reason. The Pasuk tells a reason, says a reason. Why the need for any reason in Rashi? Question number two. When Rashi gives us a reason, he changes what the Pasuk says. The Pasuk gives one reason and Rashi gives two other reasons. It's not like Rashi is explaining the reason of the Pasuk. He gives other reasons. The Pasuk says the reason they passed away was because they offered an alien fire. Comes Rashi and says, no, there's other two reasons. One reason, according to Rebbe Lezer, is because they gave a halacha. They said a halacha in front of their Rebbe Moshe. And the second reason, according to Rebbe Shmuel, is because they drank before they went into the sanctuary. And apparently these reasons are not indicated in the literal flow of the psukim. Now, if Rashi was a sefer that explored deeper layers of Torah, so we know every verse in Torah has Shivim Panim L'Torah, has 70 interpretations. The Arizal writes that every verse in Torah has 600,000 layers, corresponding to each soul. So sometimes within the simple meaning of the pasuk, there's another layer and a deeper layer and a deeper layer and a deeper layer. Rashi's objective is to explain Pshutei Shal Mikra. Rashi states this numerous times in Sefer Bereshis. I'm coming to explain the literal interpretation of the psukim. Yet Rashi gives us two reasons that are not indicated in the literal flow of the psukim. Which brings us to question number 3. Rashi wants to explain the reasons why the children of Aaron died. So his headline, the words of the pasuk that he quotes in the headline should have been, we would think, Vayamusu, and they died. And then Rashi will explain the reasons why they died. Rebbe Lezer says, Loi Meisu, only because they said a halacha in front of Moshe. And Rebbe Shmuel says they died because they were drunk when they went into the Beis HaMikdash. Rashi doesn't quote the word Vayamusu in the headline. He quotes two other words, Vateitze Eish, and fire went out. Apparently, his explanation is on the words Vayamusu, why they died. He's not explaining Vateitze Eish, the nature of the fire that went out, but these are the two words that he quotes in his headline, Vateitze Eish. Why? Question number 4. It's well known that when Rashi brings two different explanations to explain one item, it's because each one still possesses a difficulty. And each one on its own is insufficient to cover all of the problems in the pasuk. So that's why Rashi brings both of them. It is just the one that he brings first explains the pasuk a little better than the one he brings second, but there's still a difficulty, so he has to bring a second interpretation. So now the question is, why the need here for two explanations? He brings the opinion of Rebbe Lezer. Apparently there's a difficulty with that, so he brings Rebbe Shmuel. Apparently there's a difficulty with Rebbe Shmuel, which is why he brought Rebbe Lezer. What is the difficulty in each of the two explanations? Which brings us to the 5th question. It's a well-known principle in Rashi, that in the majority of Rashis, he quotes Gemara, he quotes Medrashim, and yet usually he does not quote the person who stated these explanations. Rashi quotes numerous ideas from different Tanoim and Ameirayim, from different authors in Gemara and Medrash, usually without a name. He just quotes what they said without who said it. Sometimes he does quote the name, and that's extremely significant. Why is it significant? Because Rashi feels that in these particular cases, knowing the name is helpful to understanding the message that they are communicating. The question is, why are the names relevant here? Why does Rashi feel that we ought to know Rebbe Lezer said the first explanation, Rebbe Shmuel said the second? The 6th question, and the final question, is an interesting one. Rashi's words are meticulous. There are no excessive or superfluous words in Rashi. Yet when he quotes the mashal from Vayikra Rabbah, we are struck by an enigma. Rashi does not quote the whole mashal. He says, Mashal lemelech shahayolei ben bayis v'chulu k'di'isa b'Vayikra Rabbah. Here is the question. Rashi apparently does not want to tell us what the mashal is. He doesn't. From the words mashal lemelech shahayolei ben bayis, you don't know the mashal. You just know there's a king who has a family member. That's it. What's the metaphor? What's the story? We don't know. That's why Rashi gives us a reference. He says, look into Vayikra Rabbah, look into Medrash Rabbah. In our Parsha, Parsha Shmini, Parsha Yud Beis, Piska Aleph, and Vayikra Rabbah, you have the mashal. So Rashi doesn't want to tell us the mashal. He just wants to point his finger and say, go look there for the mashal. Granted. But then he could have written the reference in brief terms. He could have written, Mashal lemelech v'chulu k'disa b'Vayikra Rabbah. There's a metaphor of a king, as it says in Vayikra Rabbah. Rashi doesn't say that. Rashi says, Moshel Melech Shahaya Ben Bayis. In other words, he doesn't only want to make reference to the mashal, he wants to give us the mashal. But he doesn't. He stops in the middle. So it means Rashi doesn't want to tell us the mashal, and yet he feels that he has to add the word Shahayole Ben Bayis, because these words add something essential to his explanation. But what? What do we gain? What type of understanding do we glean from adding the word Shahayole Ben Bayis when I still do not know what the mashal is till I look into Medrash? In the Farbrengen of Shabbos Parshas Shmini, Mevorchem HaChodesh Iyar Tavshin Chavav, Shabbos Shmini 1966, the Rebbe at the Shabbos Dike Farbrengen presented his explanation, his understanding of this Rashi, the literal interpretation of the Rashi, and then he explained the Rashi also Al Pi Chasidus. There's the famous word, the famous statement of the Alter Rebbe, the Balatanya, that in Rashi's commentary on Chumash, you have Yeno Shel Torah, you have the wine of Torah. Wine of Torah represents the mysticism of Torah, the depth, the pnimius of Torah. So he explained the Rashi not only literally, but also the Yeno Shel Torah, the wine of Torah, showing the deeper layers and symbolisms conveyed in this Rashi. And some points of this Sikha I'm going to share with you this evening. Parts of the Sikha, not all of it, parts of the Sikha were published in Likutei Sichos, volume 12, in Parshas Shmini. The reason we start with question number 3, because this becomes the reference point through which we can understand the whole Rashi. The reason Rashi in the headline quotes the two words Vateitzeyesh and not the word Vayamusu is because it's these two words that explain to us the necessity for this Rashi. If Rashi would quote Vayamusu in the headline, we would be justified asking our first two questions. The pasuk says why they died. Why give us a new explanation, and why give us different explanations? By quoting in the headline the two words Vateitzeyesh, Rashi is making clear to us that there is a tremendous problem. And it's this problem and enigma that he is attempting to address by quoting the opinions of Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Yishmael as to the reason of their death. And the problem is the two words, Vateitzeyesh, out came a fire. What is the problem? Zok the Rebbe, you're learning Chumash. Not 3, not 4, 2 psukim ago. 2 verses ago you had the same words, Vateitzeyesh. That tells us something. It said Vateitzeyesh 2 psukim ago, Perek Tes Pasuk of Dalet. 2 psukim later, Perek Yud Pasuk Beis, again the same exact words, Vateitzeyesh. The two apparently are connected. The exact same terms are used in both cases. So let's look 2 psukim ago. What does Vateitzeyesh mean? So there's the story about Moshe and Aaron laying the groundwork for the Shechina to come down into the Mishkan, into the sanctuary. The first time the sanctuary was created and dedicated and put up. This is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the first day of Nisan in the year 2449 since creation. Moshe and Aaron come out, they bless the nation, and suddenly the nation sees the glory of God. Vateitzeyesh milifnei Hashem. A fire came out from Hashem. Vatoichel al mizbeach, it consumed on the altar the offerings that were there. Vayar kolam, the nation saw. Vayareinu, they began to praise. Vayiplu al pneim, they fell on their face. Finally, the Shechina descended in all of its majesty and glory on the mizbeach in the Mishkan. Vayareinu vayiplu al pneim. The fire that came out was the symbol of the fact that the Shechina would now dwell in the Mishkan. And Rashi, a pasuk earlier, gives us the context in which it happens. Rashi says that Aaron saw that all the offerings were offered, and still the Shekhinah did not come down. And he was aggravated, and he said, I guess Hashem is angry at me, and because of me the Shekhinah didn't come down. So Moshe, he tells his brother, Moshe, this is what you did, I'm embarrassed. Moshe went in, they asked Rachamim, and the Shekhinah came down. And Rashi then continues and he says, for 7 days, Moshe and Aaron were putting up the Mishkan and putting down and taking apart the Mishkan. They're called the Shivas Yimei HaMiluyim, 7 days earlier. And yet, not once did the Shekhinah dwell in the Mishkan. So the Jews felt terribly embarrassed, and they told Moshe Rabbeinu, all the work and toil that we put in order that the Shekhinah should dwell among us, and we should know that the sin of the golden calf was atoned, all of the work was in vain. The collecting the money and the contributions and the donations and the building and the designing, it was all in vain. 7 days the Mishkan is going up and the Shekhinah is not coming down. So Moshe told them, my brother Aaron, his contribution, his service is significant enough that through his karbanos, through his avodah, the Shekhinah will come down. And indeed, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, a fire came out, and when the Jews saw it, they were overwhelmed from joy. Vayoreinu, they began to extol, they began to sing, they began to dance. Vayiplu al pneim, they fell on their face. Meaning that the Vateitzei 2 psukim ago represent not just a positive thing, but an extraordinarily positive thing. Something so intense, so powerful, something that the Jews were waiting, and it represented to them the beginning of a new era. Finally, the sin of the golden calf has been atoned. So the words Vateitzei, just 2 psukim ago, capture within them a great moment. One of the greatest moments in ancient Jewish history. A moment that they have been waiting for months and months and months since they created the golden calf, and they were seeking atonement. And now, 2 psukim later, the same words, Vateitzei, and in the most negative context. Here the Vateitzei causes death. Here the Vateitzei consumes the lives of Aaron's 2 sons, Nadav and Avihu. So the student is wondering, why would the Torah use the same exact words? Vateitzei 2 psukim ago represent something so positive. And the same words, Vateitzei, reflect and represent something so negative. The Vateitzei that's earlier did not come on its own. It took work and work. Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't accomplish it. Moshe Rabbeinu, 7 days, he couldn't accomplish it. The 8th day it happened on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. In other words, to create that Vateitzei required tremendous effort, tremendous sacrifice. And that's for something positive. And here, the same Vateitzei, the same words. One of the greatest, and yet it denotes something absolutely destructive and negative. This is the question that's bothering Rashi. What does it mean? What does this mean? What is the Torah trying to hint? What is the Torah trying to convey? If the previous Vateitzei was something so difficult to create, it was something so sublime and positive. This Vateitzei is something so negative and destructive. It's harder to create something positive than to create something negative. We all know that. It's much easier to destroy than it is to build. How long does it take to build a friendship? How long does it take to destroy a friendship? How long does it take to build a home? How long does it take to destroy a home? So the previous Vateitzei took so much effort. And here you have the same Vateitzei in something destructive and negative. This is what's bothering Rashi. And because of this, Rashi tells us here a gewaltige chiddush. He understands the psukim in a new way. Rashi says, you know what, you're right. You know why the Torah uses the same 2 words, Vateitzei, to tell you that the same thing that happened 2 psukim earlier happened here once again. What happened 2 psukim earlier? The Shekhinah was revealed in the Mishkan. That is what happened here again. Vateitzei, a tremendous isgalus of the Shekhinah, a tremendous revelation of the Shekhinah. That is why the pasuk uses the same words. It was the same experience, the positive experience there, repeated itself here again. Vateitzei, the same words. How can you say such a thing? 2 people died. Zakt Rashi, Amar Rebbe Lezer Omer, Loi meisu b'nei Aaron, Eloi de'shayru halacha b'fnei Moshe Rabbeinu. What is Rashi telling us? They did not die only for one reason. What is the loy meisu? Why is he emphasizing it with the negative? Because he wants to tell us what the pasuk is telling us with the words vateitzayesh is. That the act of Nadav and Avihu in and of itself, the carbon that they brought, the ketores that they offered, was something that had tremendous holiness to the extent that it generated a vateitzayesh identical to the vateitzayesh 2 psukim ago, representing the revelation of the Shekhinah in the Mishkan. But there was one issue. Loi Meisu, the only reason they died was not because the Ketores was vain or mundane. Ella mipnei shahiru alocha b'fnei Moshe Rabban. Because the act of sacrificing this in the presence of Moshe without consulting him, without seeking his advice, that is what caused this tremendous hisgalus of the Shekhinah to affect them in a negative way. Loi Meisu, that's the reason. Moshe Rabbeinu is here, the Rebbe is here. Your Rebbe is here. And yet on their own they went and they offered the Ketores without asking Moshe. That itself was the Hiru Halacha. That itself was, they didn't only say something verbally. They did something in the presence of Moshe. They could have asked him. For them to do something in the presence of when Moshe Rabbeinu was here, and yet they didn't consult him, they didn't ask him, they went ahead and they offered the Ketores. This was the negative thing that caused their passing. But here you can ask a question. Because of such an act of not consulting Moshe Rabbeinu, of doing something in the presence of Moshe Rabbeinu, taking matters into your own hands and bringing Ketores, because of that they deserve to die. It's difficult to understand. That's why Rashi has to quote Rebbe Lezer. Because when we know the name of Rebbe Lezer, we can appreciate Rebbe Lezer's perspective that this is the reason they died. It's known that Rebbe Lezer's greatness in Torah is described by Chazal in unparalleled ways. The Medrash says in Pirkei that Rebbe Lezer Perek Beis, that they told Rebbe Lezer, you could tell us Torah more than what the Jewish people received at Mount Sinai. In Medrash Hashirim Rabbah it says that the stone, Rebbe Lezer was sitting on a stone and saying Torah. So they said this stone upon which Rebbe Lezer sat is like Har Sinai. And Rebbe Lezer who sat on the stone is like the Aron Habris with the Luchos on Har Sinai. So imagine Rebbe Lezer's stone, the stone he's sitting, that's Mount Sinai. Why is it Har Sinai? Because Rebbe Lezer is on it. Rebbe Lezer is the Luchos. Rebbe Lezer is the Torah itself that's on Har Sinai. We know the Mishnah of his Perek Beis, Rebbe Lezer is described as Boris Sucheinem Abetipa. That student who did not lose a single drop of Torah. He was Torah. He is the Luchos Habris. He sits on a stone. That stone is Har Sinai. And yet in the Gemara in Brachas, Daf Chav Zayin Amid Beis, comes Rebbe Lezer and says, Ha'omer davar shelo shama mipi Rabbi. Somebody who says something that he did not hear from his Rebbe, Goyrem l'shchina shetistalek mi Yisrael. He causes the Shekhinah to depart from the Jewish people. So Rebbe Lezer is telling us that notwithstanding one's greatness in Torah, Rebbe Lezer himself, his greatness and his unity and his depth of understanding and his memory is unparalleled and extraordinary. And yet, if you would come to Rebbe Lezer and you'd say, "Nu, tell me something on your own," Rebbe Lezer would say, if you say something not in the name of the Rebbe, your Rebbe, Goyrem l'shchina shetistalek mi Yisrael. So we can understand, if somebody not only says something that he didn't hear from his Rebbe, but he says something new in front of his Rebbe, how serious that is in the eyes of Rebbe Lezer. And that's why it's Rebbe Lezer who says, Loi meisu b'nei Aaron ela al yidei shahiru alocha b'fnei Moshe Rabbeinu. And the words that Rebbe Lezer chooses in brachos are significant. Goyrem l'shchina shetistalek mi Yisrael. This is what happens. The Ktoiris that Nadav and Avihu bring cause Vateitzeyesh. What does Vateitzeyesh symbolize? We explained the Gilui of the Shekhinah, the revelation of the Shekhinah. But the way they did it, the fact that they did it without Moshe Rabbeinu's consent, in the presence of Moshe on their own, they went and they stated a halacha that they did not hear from Moshe Rabbeinu. That caused the opposite. That causes Shekhinah to stalik Yisrael. It caused the departure of the Shekhinah from the Jewish people, which resulted in their passing. Or to put it in different terms, in more mystical terms, one could say, Nadav and Avihu were such great tzaddikim that their lifeline was dependent upon their relationship with God. For them, a relationship with the Shekhinah wasn't a luxury. It was the very source of their life, like in a very conscious way, like a fish in water. You take the fish out of water, the fish has no choice but to die because you removed it from the source of its life. Nadav and Avihu, when they removed themselves from the Shekhinah, by separating themselves on some level from Moshe Rabbeinu, by becoming autonomous, by becoming independent from Moshe Rabbeinu, they detached themselves from their own source of life, which we will explain a little later in the Shir. Yet here, we have two questions. Question number one that's bothering Rashi: how is it really possible that Nadav and Avihu should behave this way? Become autonomous from Moshe Rabbeinu, and not only quote something they didn't hear from their Rebbe, but do something in front of their Rebbe that they did not hear from him. Number two, there's a little bit of a paradox here. On one hand, we're saying that Teitzeyesh represents that they generated a revelation of the Shekhinah. On the other hand, we're saying that by doing something in front of Moshe without his permission and consent, they caused the Shekhinah to depart from Israel. So how can both things happen simultaneously? It's like a mitzvah haba ba'avera. They're doing the mitzvah through an avera, or they're generating the revelation of Shekhinah through doing something which removes the Shekhinah. How can both things happen? If Hayru Halacha B'fnei Rabban removes the Shekhinah, how is it possible that through that they brought down the Shekhinah of Ateitzeyesh? This is the problem with Rebbe Lezer. So that's why Rashi brings a second explanation. Rabbi Shmuel Omer. Rabbi Shmuel Omer Suye Yayin Nichnasu L'Mikdash. They went in drinking. This explanation of Rabbi Shmuel answers both questions. First of all, there's no question, how is this possible to happen? How can they do it? They were not commanded not to go into the Mishkan drunk. According to Rebbe Lezer, they did something that was clearly wrong before that. It violated the unity, the respect, the awe, the reverence, the connection with Moshe. But according to Rabbi Shmuel's opinion, they didn't do anything wrong technically because they were not commanded not to go into the Mishkan drunk. The commandment was given only later. This also explains how they could generate the revelation of the Shekhinah, because since they did not do any Aveira, they did not violate the commandment of Hashem, so it was not a mitzvah haba ba'avera. So therefore, through this avoid of Ktoiris, they can cause Vateitzeyesh Dashras HaShechina. And now it's clear why Rashi says in Rabbi Shmuel, Teda, proof that after they died, he warned the remainders that they shouldn't come in drunk to the Mishkan. Rashi is not just explaining why suddenly Hashem tells Aaron, don't drink before you come into the Mishkan. Rashi is telling us also something else. He's explaining to us the advantage of Rabbi Shmuel's explanation over Rabbi Eliezer's explanation. Because what Rashi is saying is, Teda she'achar misason hizir. After they died, he warned the remainders not to come in drunk. Which means that according to Rabbi Shmuel, the children of Aaron did not transgress the commandment of Hashem while they offered the Ktoiris, because they were not commanded not to come in drunk. It's only achar misason, after their death, that he warned them. If so, you might ask a big question. Why were they punished? According to Rebbe Lezer, I understand. Rebbe Lezer believes that to detach from your Rebbe in front of him, Goyrim l'shchina shetastalik, it has very severe consequences. According to Rebbe Yishmael, why were they punished? They were never commanded not to come in drunk. They were never commanded. It's unfair. That's why Rashi says, Mashal l'melech shahaya loy ben bayis v'chulu k'disim v'ayikri rabba. So in our last question, question number 6, we asked, Memanavshach. If Rashi wants to bring the whole mashal, bring the whole mashal. You don't want to bring the whole mashal, you just want to give reference, say Mashal l'melech. Now we will understand the meticulousness in every word of Rashi. Tamuru. What does the Medrash say in Parsha Shmini? What's the story? The Medrash says there, Mashal l'melech sha'ayalei ben bayis nema. There was a king who had a faithful ben bayis who lived with him in the home. One day the king finds him standing al Pesach Hanuyas. The man who lives in his home, who grew up in his home, is hanging out at the storefronts of stores. He's hanging out at the doors at storefronts, and the nature of the stores is that they are very immodest, profane places. As commentators say, they are stores where alcohol is being consumed in titanic and enormous quantities. So it's a place for drunkards, for alcoholics. Or it's stores in which promiscuous relationships are taking place. But whatever the case, these are storefronts in which a dignified, moral, high-standing human being should not be present. V'hitiz es roishe b'shtika. The king had him killed silently. And the king appointed a second ben bayis, a second resident in his home instead of the first. But nobody knew why he killed the first. It was done silently. Later they heard that he commanded the second ben bayis, don't go to those storefronts that are promiscuous. Don't go to those storefronts that are profane. Now we know if this is the warning, so now we know that's why he killed the first. So the Medrash says in Vayikra Rabbah, this is what happened here too. It says a fire came out and consumed them. We don't know why they died. Why? But since Hashem tells Aaron, Yayin v'shecher al tej, don't drink. Now we know they died because of drinking. Because this is why he's warning Aaron, don't drink. So everybody learns Rashi, that Rashi is just quoting the Moshe. Rabbi Shmuel says they died drunk, and that's why he commands Aaron not to drink. So Rashi says Mashal l'melech. But then the question is Sha'ayalei ben bayis. But the emes is, there's a whole new depth in this Rashi that we'll now understand. What's the vort in the Medrash? Did the king command the first ben bayis not to go to these stores? No. The second one he commanded not to go to these stores. The first one he never did command. 2, not to hang out at these stores. So why did he punish him so severely? The answer is because he was a ben bayis. He was somebody living in the king's home, and since he's somebody living in the king's home, he could have and should have understood and felt on his own that this is not a place for him. This is why Rashi quotes the word Shahayale ben bayis, because this answers the question. Why were Bnei Aaron punished for something that they were not commanded on? If Hashem would have commanded them earlier, do not drink before going into the Mishkan, grant. He never did. Achar misason, he commanded them, not before. That's the advantage of Rabbi Shmuel over Rebbe Lezer. This explains to us how they can generate the Shechina and how they can do it. So if that's the case, why were they punished? So Rashi says, Mashal melech shayalei ben bayis.